No, he's not from the state of Georgia. He's in the country of Georgia. Some people. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Otar Taktakishvili. Otar Taktakishvili was born in July 1924 in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, into a wealthy and musical family. He was raised by a single mother who worked at the Georgian opera house, and two of his uncles were involved in music. One was a composer and the other was a cellist. As you can see, he came from a musically inclined background, and so from an early age he was exposed to all of this, and as a result he had perfect pitch. His initial musical training came at the piano, which he studied throughout high school, and eventually entered the Tbilisi Conservatory in 1942 to study it. I can't quite tell why someone in their late teens and early 20s, this otherwise healthy guy, would not have been drafted and served in the Soviet army, but I guess his family might have had connections. Either way, there's no evidence of him actually having any military service. Soon after matriculating, he entered a contest to write the music for the new lyrics that were published for a national anthem of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. So he dashed something off and sent it in, and he didn't know whether he'd won or lost until one day he heard it being performed by a band on the street, and he goes, "Oh, I wrote that. I guess I won." Nice. It was during his career at the conservatory that Taktakishvili began to really develop his own style. He used Georgian folk melodies in addition to the idioms pioneered by his Russian contemporaries. Taktakishvili was even able to study under Dmitry Shostakovich, the biggest name in Russian music, during his final year at the Tbilisi Conservatory. They became friends and even stayed in touch after Taktakishvili's graduation. 2 years later, he was hired by the same institution from which he graduated, applying what he learned there, on top of, I suppose, his perfect pitch, to becoming a choral director. A good chunk of his day-to-day musical work was in the realm of choral music, and much of his music is choral, or at the very least, vocally inspired. This is especially true for the latter half of his career, which is much more outwardly choral. He was very attuned to the folk songs and melodies of his homeland, and he was keen to use Georgian material in any way he could in his mature music. Specifically, Georgia had a very deep and very ongoing polyphonic choral tradition, a tradition into which Taktakishvili freely dipped. Because Taktakishvili's music did not push the boundaries as much as the works of some other Soviet-era composers in the Eastern Bloc, his work was pretty much the darling of the authorities. He was awarded People's Artist and state prizes on more than one occasion. His genius was not that of Shostakovich or Prokofiev, who found ways to subvert and elide what the authorities wanted to hear out of their music. Rather, he was perfectly comfortable working in the style known as Soviet realism, and really making it his own. Because of this, his music still retains an accessibility that many of his contemporaries just don't have, because he was perfectly fine playing by the Soviet rules. It's what he wanted to do artistically anyway, from what I understand. By far the most popular example of this is his Flute Sonata, which is now a staple of the 20th century flute repertory, even though it took, because of copyright reasons, over a decade to reach the United States from its Soviet origins. He even railed against Schoenberg's 12-tone technique and its myriad Western followers, saying that writing music that actively chose to buck this trend was akin to an acute ideological struggle. And even though he might have just been towing the party line by saying this, there was an element of truth to it, given the sheer stranglehold the serialists held over the Western conservatory system. He disliked it because he thought it cold and calculating and entirely unemotional. He did hold some Western composers in high regard, like Kurt Weill and Karl Orff, but he never expressed admiration for a serialist. Because his style aligned with what the authorities looked for in Soviet music, he was made the secretary of the USSR Composers Union from 1957 all the way until February 1989, when he died at the age of 64. The street on which he and his wife, his high school sweetheart, lived for several decades was renamed after him in his honor. Taktakishvili's main goal was the preservation and the continuation of Georgian art, with folk music and literature numbers 1 and 2 on the list. Although it should be noted that the material from which he drew was not just from Georgia, but also from the greater Caucasus region, But the music of all of these regions are so close that they're really intertwined. The music of the Greater Caucasus is a better way to describe the music he was using versus just Georgian folk music, which is a little bit of a misnomer. All of these different traditions share a lot of underlying patterns and similarities, sort of like dialects of the same language. Judging by all the beautiful and lyrical music which we have, I'd say that he did a pretty good job.